So here are some quick notes on adjusting retention on the Henry Ember and understanding draw stroke, and a couple of things you need to keep in mind when dealing with compact light bearing holsters. So the first thing is, on our Ember, we normally have a retention notch molded in on the front side if you are right-handed. And there's nothing molded in as far as a retention point on the back. And the reason for this is, on the various versions of the TLR7 sub, the tightening screw protrudes through that face, where on this side, there's nothing interfering there. So we can get our retention to lock behind this shoulder, but if you try to put a similar shape back here, this screw bites through it and makes the retention feel really trashy and draggy and super awful. The other thing, this is true of all light bearing holsters, is once your gun's holstered up, you have this unsupported area between the light body down here and the trigger guard in the mouth of the holster. That can be compressed because it's functionally unsupported. There's just air around the trigger guard of the gun, which means light bearing holsters are more sensitive to belt tightness, because if you compress them hard, you can actually flex the mouth of the holster closed a little bit more. And you also, in this case where you've got a retention notch on one side and not on the other, when you're drawing the firearm, if you try to come forward and up rather than coming straight up your body and out, you will actually be try to pull through the retention point, not past the retention point. Also, the angle of your grip matters, because if you take and you rotate the grip away from your body as a right-handed shooter drawing, if you rotate the grip out, you are pushing the firearm in the light harder into the retention point, where if when you draw, you are bringing the end of that grip in towards your body, you are reducing the hold of that retention point. So you'll get a smoother, cleaner draw if you come in on that gun and you're bringing it in this way, just a little bit. Doesn't need to be much. We're not talking about big motions, just not pulling out and pulling forward, because you can lock the gun up in the holster very, very easily if you're trying to pull it through the retention point. So, as far as retention adjustments, light bearing holsters always have less click than non-light bearing holsters, because the amount of surface area that we create our retention on is much smaller. This little shoulder right here is way less area, way less meat to work with than the trigger guard on a Glock 17. And so for that reason, you can adjust it to get some click, but you're not going to get huge amounts of click. And when the gun's out of the holster, since there's so much space there, the holster can compress more. Adjustable retention holsters, if you have those two retention screws adjusted out of pitch, not parallel, it can actually cause the mouth of the holster to contract shut, and that can make reholstering a little more awkward. Not impossible, but a little more awkward. So my recommendations are, be willing to accept a relatively lighter amount of retention on a light bearing holster than you might expect from a standard holster where you're locking onto something really meaty like the trigger guard. And then understand that your overall pants and belt compression, if you've got it on an Enigma or you're wearing it on a gun belt, just a trouser belt, the amount of compression you put on that's going to have a heightened effect on how the retention feels. And light bearing holsters are more susceptible to locking up from over compression than a standard holster is. Hopefully that answers some questions.